Floisy. I'm a PhD student in Danielle Ulrich's lab at Montana State University, and I am your host this month. And I co-organized this series with Karina Lee, a master's student at the University of Colorado, Denver, and Enzo Martillamoya, a PhD student in Kara Nelson's lab at the University of Montana. We have another great presentation for today, and I'd like to start by introducing our board member, Kara Nelson, who will share a few announcements with us. Welcome, Kara.
Thanks so much, Lou. I have the great pleasure of giving a few minutes of update on activities within the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. Each month at the start of the webinar, we provide an update on the foundation because the foundation, of course, is the host for the webinar series. So I'll be putting in the chat information about how to join the foundation and how to find out about foundation activities. The foundation update for today is actually on the webinar series. I have the bittersweet task of thanking our current webinar organizers for all of the amazing work they've done running the webinar series, not just this year, but last year as well. So Lou, Karina, and Enzo, we are really grateful for the fantastic job that you've done. You have built an incredible webinar community and delivered not just one series, but two series of really high quality webinars each month. I hope that we will all see you joining the webinars into the future every month and adding your comments and questions. My other task, along with really, sharing my deep gratitude to the three of you, is to welcome our incoming organizers for the series next year. We have first Mike Mahoney, who is a PhD student in UC Davis in Hugh Saffer's lab. Mike studies bird populations and their response to disturbances like fire, and then applies that information to conservation and land management practices. For his dissertation, he, of course, is working on whitebark pine and specifically Clark's nutcracker seed dispersal patterns in the Eastern Sierras. Then we have Marissa Eng, who is a master's student in the Smithers Lab at Montana State University. She is looking at both whitebark pine and limber pine and specifically restoration efforts in Glacier National Park, where she has worked for the last 5 years on vegetation monitoring. Marissa came to the interior Northwest from Vermont, where she did her bachelor's at University of Vermont and also worked for Vermont Fish and Wildlife and also the Forest Service. And then Jeremy, who many of you will know, Jeremy Greenberg, because he was a recent presenter in the webinar series. And apparently it was fun because he said yes when invited to join the organizer team. He recently completed his master's in forestry at the University of British Columbia. He has worked with Parks Canada for 14 years and recently focusing on whitebark pine conservation. He is also on the board of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation of Canada. So we're really grateful to the three of you for being willing to share your time and help with organizing the webinars for next year. And you will be hearing from our new team in August when we announce the speakers for next year. I missed one thing in introducing Mike. He is also on the conference team for the Foundation's Lake Tahoe conference next fall. So you may be hearing from him in that capacity. So in the meantime, before August, when you receive news on the series for next year, we would love to hear your ideas about the webinar. To facilitate that, I will be putting in the chat a link to a survey. You can put comments, you can put ideas for speakers, you can indicate that you want to speak yourself in the series next year, and I will also be putting the email address for the webinar series. So thanks so much, and I'll turn it back over to Lou, and I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much for joining us, Kara, and for all of those wonderful updates. If you missed any of our previous installments, you can find recordings of our talks on our YouTube channel. We'll go ahead and post the link in the chat. Finally, after our presentation, we will have a Q&A session where you can share your comments, doubts, and questions. Please go ahead and post them into the chat box, and our team will be collecting them, and then we'll ask our presenter at the end of their presentation. And then finally, I'm excited to introduce you to today's presenter. Dr. Sara Germain is an assistant professor at the University of Wyoming. Her primary research blends dendroecological techniques with spatially resolved community ecology to understand how mechanisms of individual tree survival and regeneration give rise to forest change, particularly in response to climate and climate-altered disturbance regimes. Field sites include ForestGEO demography plots in Grand Teton National Park. Dr. Germain completed her PhD at Utah State University in 2022 and was a postdoctoral research associate at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies from 2022 to 2023 before beginning her time at the University of Wyoming. And with that, I'll leave it to Sara.
All right, thank you so much, Lou. I am so excited to be here as a relatively recent member of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. So really excited to meet you all and to get to chat a little bit, hopefully in the time afterwards during the Q&A session. So let me get my screen up here. Can everyone see that okay? Thumbs up. All right, well, to kick us off here, I want to just kind of give a little description of where I'm coming from when I think about forests. So I have been studying old growth forests of the Western US as a field ecologist for over the past decade or so. And that's included everything from bristlecone pine down in southern Utah to the giant trees of the Pacific Northwest and kind of everything in between. And something that I really love about studying old trees is the fact that these old trees, sometimes thousands of years old, have tolerated multiple stressors throughout their entire lives. How do they do that? And what happens when they're not able to tolerate those stresses anymore? So ultimately, why do some trees die and others survive? And then how are these processes of stress tolerance and tree survival changing as a result of anthropogenic changes like warming climate? So based on these kind of big picture questions, it was a really natural next step for me to start looking into whitebark pine in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. These trees can be incredibly long-lived, over 1,000 years old for some of the oldest, and they're facing changing stressors from everything from warming subalpine climates to white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle. And the way that all of these different stressors culminate in the ultimate fate of survival or mortality for these trees is a really fascinating question. So to kind of contextualize what I'll be discussing today, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which many of you are probably familiar with there in northern Wyoming and southern Montana, has been warming, especially in the past 40 years or so. We have experienced rapid rates of warming, both in terms of elevated temperature and in terms of the declines in snowpack and perennial ice features as a consequence of those warming climates. And something to point out here is that this climate change in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is happening more than double the rate of the global average. So what this is really providing evidence for is that elevation dependent warming, right? That idea that mountainous areas tend to warm more quickly than lowland areas. And this is part of what makes studying whitebark pine responses across an elevational gradient so interesting to consider. Now, of course, warming in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is nothing new, right? So just about 6,000 years ago during the mid-Holocene, temperatures were about 2 degrees Celsius warmer than they currently are. And this really fantastic study published a couple years ago talked about the whitebark pine forest that was found underneath a receding mountain glacier, an alpine glacier. So as you can see in this figure, they were able to find that whitebark pine tree line was actually 600 feet higher in the past than it is in modern day. So one of the questions here is, well, with warming temperatures, is this going to simply happen again? Will whitebark pine just shift upwards in elevation and be fine? This concept of migration following elevational gradients is really predicated on the very simple observation that the tops of mountains are cool and wet, and the bottoms of mountains are warm and dry as a consequence of various orographic and adiabatic processes. So for whitebark's elevational range in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, spanning roughly 7,000 to 10,000 feet, another way of thinking about this is whether those forests are energy limited or water limited. So at the top, in that kind of alpine treeline ecotone and subalpine area at the tops of mountains, there's plenty of water, plenty of snowpack in the winter. And what's really limiting tree growth in these areas is temperature, cold growing seasons and short growing seasons. And then on the flip side, in those water limited forests, there is plenty of energy available for photosynthesis. Summers get plenty warm, but summers tend to be dry in this area. So the growth that we see in these lower elevation forests tend to be water limited. Now, as climate changes in mountainous areas, what we would expect to happen is mobility in that threshold between water limitation and energy limitation. And so ultimately what's happening here is for those forests kind of caught in between in this region of change somewhere in a mid-elevational band, is they're experiencing a fundamental change in stressors. Right? So they're going from kind of being acclimated to this energy limited environment to now experiencing, sometimes for the first time, prolonged water limitation. And in the face of these fundamental changes in the stress profile of montane forests, there's really only three options that tree populations have. They can migrate, right? So this is what that glacier study was noting, and many others have noted that trees can go up and down in elevation to follow this moving climatic niche. They can adapt, right? Populations can adapt, but this is very difficult to do amidst the rapid rates of warming that we are experiencing. And finally, they can acclimate. So that's when individual trees are able to shift their physiology and reallocate certain things in order to adjust to that new environment. And it's this idea of acclimation that's particularly fascinating to me in the context of old trees and how they're able to be so old in the first place. So if forests are unable to do any of these three things, ultimately what we see is local extinction. And when we consider the way that disturbance is kind of overlaid on top of this change in climate stressor, this is something that we are experiencing here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with respect to whitebark pine. So in that kind of zone of change where those forests are experiencing a fundamental change in stressors, there's kind of two different alternatives that I want to point out here. The first is warming happens and an energy limited forest stays energy limited. In this diagram, you can see that there's these large snowpacks in the winter, and as things melt out during the spring and summer, there's still plenty of water available. So with warmer temperatures, we would expect more growth in these energy limited systems because there's more energy now available for photosynthesis. The growing season is longer, and there's plenty of water available for the trees to keep up with that elevated demand. Now, the alternative is that an energy limited system now becomes water limited. So this is that fundamental shift. And so in the diagram, what we're really seeing here is that smaller snowpacks are melting out faster. And by the time summer comes around, there's not enough water available. So even though those warmer temperatures are hypothetically contributing more energy for photosynthesis, we're actually experiencing a shorter effective growing season for trees in this scenario because they don't have the water resources necessary for keeping up with that photosynthetic demand. So with warming temperatures, we would actually expect less growth for trees that have experienced this shift towards a water limited kind of condition. And this is exactly what we're seeing all across the planet. So this is a really elegant study using tree rings over the 20th century that found that we are experiencing this shift from temperature limitation to water limitation in many of our boreal and montane forests. So the thing to really pick out of this figure are those bright yellow and bright red colors, indicating that those forests experienced a change from primarily temperature limitation or energy limitation to precipitation or water limitation. And part of the reason that this is happening is because we're not just experiencing warmer summers, but we're also experiencing warmer winters. And that's driving reduced snowpack and increased snowmelt rates. And this is something that actually sets contemporary climate change apart from that mid-Holocene change that we talked about previously. During the mid-Holocene, about 6,000 years ago, we had warmer summers, yes, but we also had cooler winters. So in addition to the faster rate of warming we're experiencing, these warmer winters are really altering the climate for these forests in a way that has not perfectly been experienced by these trees before. And what I want to really point out here is that if you look at some of those bright red and yellow areas inside the kind of continental regions of the world, we see that the montane areas stand apart from the surrounding lowland areas. So those little specks of yellow and red in the Rocky Mountains, Andes, and Tibetan Plateau are once again kind of demonstrating this concept of elevation-dependent warming, where mountainous areas are experiencing these shifts to water limitation at a greater rate than the lowland areas surrounding them. And of course, I've been talking a lot about climate, but it's not necessarily all about climate, because as things get warmer, other stressors begin to increase as well, right? So we have these declining water resources, which can also trigger stronger competitive relationships between trees. And for whitebark pine, this is significant, right? Because it's a shade intolerant tree. It's not quite as competitive. It's very slow growing. And so as these other species are moving in and really competing for water resources, that can put quite a stress on whitebark pine. And then, of course, we have those disturbance agents of white pine blister rust, the invasive pathogen, and mountain pine beetle, our native bark beetle that is able now to expand into these once cooler montane habitats and shows higher survival rates, faster generation times in a warmer climate. So all of these different stressors exacerbated by warming have contributed to the recent listing of threatened status for whitebark pine, as many of you I'm sure are quite familiar with. And I don't want to belabor this point too much, but this is alarming given the fact that with whitebark pine's threatened status, we're not just losing a species, right? We're losing an ecosystem, because whitebark pine is considered a keystone species. And many folks, even in this webinar series from, for example, Diana Tombach's lab, have discussed how whitebark pine is a tree island initiator. So it's really helping these other species to establish, especially in that uppermost alpine treeline ecotone where things are really harsh. So these whitebark are able to establish, create more stable and nutritious soils through organic deposits, protect these little plants from solar and wind, kind of extreme climate variability, and really in so doing, contributing to high elevation biodiversity and wildlife habitat. So this raises the question that if climate change is threatening whitebark pine, does it also threaten these ecosystem services that we are really concerned with? So what I want to do today is share with you a series of 3 studies that goes through each of these different steps of figuring out, well, is water truly more limiting in some of these whitebark pine forests? And if so, what does that mean? It doesn't matter in terms of whitebark pine stress and survival. And then in these areas where we have experienced high whitebark pine mortality, what's going on with biodiversity? Is biodiversity resilient, or are we seeing climate warming threaten those ecosystem services in a similar way as they've been threatening whitebark survival? So let's start off with this question of whether temperature or water is more limiting at upper tree line. And for this study, we really wanted to look at that very most upper tree line habitat at about 10,000 feet to test how far this threshold is moving upwards in elevation. And for this study, we'll be really focusing on that acclimation question. I'm not looking at population level processes here. We're just looking at whether these old trees are able to handle a change in stressors, if they exist. So for this work, my PhD student Jared Friedman collected 34 whitebark pine tree cores from Grand Teton National Park. So again, kind of at that southern range extent of whitebark pine in the Rockies. And he collected these from a whitebark dominated stand very near to the alpine treeline ecotone. So as you can see in this photo, all of our trees are actual trees. They're not growing in Krumholtz form, but they are exclusively growing in tree islands. And so this is not a closed canopy forest. And what he did was he measured the tree rings for each of these cores. Sometimes they were very small. I was amazed at how slow growing these whitebark pine are up in this high elevation habitat. And then he used those trends in tree growth, annual tree growth, to make correlations with climate variables. So today I'll be sharing some of the results from the growth correlation analysis with snow water equivalent, really testing that hypothesis of whether dwindling snowpacks are influencing tree growth, and temperature minimums across all different months. And so this is done along a 30-year moving window timeline. And so we're able to look all the way back to the beginning of the instrumental record in the kind of mid 1900s here for this analysis. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that during this work, Jared found the new record oldest whitebark pine at 1,277 years old. So this really just highlights for me how long these trees have been dealing with variations in climate, annual variations in weather and trends in climate, and all kinds of different biotic interactions for many, many years. But it's also important to note that this oldest champion tree died 5 years ago. So there's something fundamentally different about what these trees are experiencing now. This one in particular was killed by the complex white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle. So this tree is now succumbing to stressors in a way that it wasn't ever succumbing to in the past. So for some of these results that I want to share with you of the growth climate correlations, I want to walk you through what we would expect to see in those results first. So kind of what hypothesis we're testing. So for this, if these trees are growing in a temperature limited state, then what we would expect is that warmer springs and summers would result in more growth, right? So that blue color there indicating a positive relationship between temperature and growth. And on the other hand, we would expect a negative relationship between snowpack and growth, because higher snowpacks often indicate cooler temperatures and a shorter growing season. And now sometimes these temperature and snowpack dynamics are coupled within a given year, but not necessarily. There can be years where you have very warm summers and really large snowpacks happening at the same time. So on the other hand, if these trees are growing in a more water limited state, we would expect that warmer temperatures would actually result in less growth, right? So even though there's more energy available for photosynthesis, the growing season's a little longer, there's not necessarily enough water available. So those water limited trees are actually stressed by warming temperatures and show that to us with reduced growth. And then, of course, on the other hand, higher snowpacks we would expect to be good for trees growing in a water limited system, because that would fill in this dry creek bed in the image on the right and provide water for trees during the summer. So what did we find? Let's start with temperature. So these are the results of the growth temperature correlation analysis, where time in those 30-year moving average windows is along the x-axis, and then each of the months of the year are along the y-axis. And even if you just kind of step back and take a look at this figure, what you see is on the left side, we have more blue. So this positive relationship between temperature and growth. And on the right side, we see more red, a negative relationship between temperature and growth. And so what this is really telling us is that back in the mid 20th century, there was some evidence suggesting that these trees were growing in a temperature limited state, which is exactly what we would expect at upper tree line. But over time, into these modern years and recent decades, we are now seeing strong water limitation. And I say strong because of those asterisks there. So those are indicating that these are very strong correlations. All the trees are agreeing that water is the most limiting factor. So we've seen a shift in this forest from temperature to water limitation. So what about when it comes to snowpack? We see a similar story here, not quite as strong of results, but again, they are on the left side in the past, so that mid 20th century, we see a little bit more red, some neutral colors there. And then in modern decades here on the right-hand side, we see dark blue. So what that's showing is that over time, the importance of snowpack to growth has been increasing. So again, more evidence supporting this hypothesis that these upper tree line forests have become more water limited in recent decades. And what one kind of way to really synthesize this information is to look at those correlations change over time. This is just looking at June. So we have June snow water equivalent in green and June temperature in red. And what you can see is that back in that historic period in the mid 20th century, there was no statistical significance, right? So there were no asterisks in those previous slides in the historical era. And part of what that's telling us is that the trees simply didn't agree on what aspects of climate were most important for growth. That's showing us that things like competition, microsite differences, kind of these small scale factors at the scale of an individual tree were more important than the overlying kind of umbrella climate signal that's going on. And of course, here in recent decades, since about 1985, we've seen forests passing a tipping point where now higher snowpacks are increasing growth and warmer temperatures are decreasing growth. And these are statistically significant relationships. Not only that, but what that's telling us is that trees are more strongly agreeing on this idea that water is most limiting. So just to kind of summarize our findings from that first study in Grand Teton, warmer temperatures and changing precipitation patterns reduced snowpack in a way that was reducing tree growth, right? So water is now more limiting than temperature. And this is perhaps not entirely surprising, even at upper tree line, given that we're sampling at the southernmost range extent of whitebark pine in the Rockies. So we might expect climate warming to have more dramatic impacts on these populations compared to those up in the northern Rockies or even the coastal populations of whitebark pine. Okay, so does it matter, right? So these trees are experiencing a shift in limiting factor, a fundamental change in what is stressing them in these montane environments. But does it matter to survival? So for this study, we thought it was really important to look at all of these different stressors that were impacting whitebark pine, not just climate. So I want to just highlight this, make sure that we are on the same page about white pine blister rust being an invasive pathogen that really infects trees and weakens them, makes them more susceptible to mortality that is most proximately caused by insects like mountain pine beetle. And mountain pine beetle historically had only very episodic interactions with whitebark pine in these high elevation habitats. And warming has allowed for larger bark beetle populations and more frequent outbreaks that is unprecedented in this area. So the tree mortality that we've seen in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, ranging between 50 to 100% in some drainages, is caused by the whole suite of interactions between these factors and most proximately by mountain pine beetle. So for this work, we went just outside of Yellowstone National Park in the Shoshone National Forest, again, coring some trees, but this time we picked 7 live and 7 dead trees that were killed by mountain pine beetle so that we could make these comparisons between surviving and killed trees. And I also want to point out that this is a very different forest type than the previous one that I discussed. This photo here is showing that it is more or less a closed canopy forest. It's a much denser forest. This is not tree islands, not a ribbon forest, and certainly not a tree line ecotone. but still relatively high elevation. So this is going to be a much more competitive environment than some of the higher elevation, more sparsely, with a sparser canopy forest type for whitebark pine. And I also want to give a shout out to my co-authors for this work, many co-authors, but especially to Matthew Becker, Georg von Ark, who led some of the wood anatomy sampling, and Justin DeRose and Adam Sank, who led some of the isotope sampling for that tree physiology paper. So you might be wondering why the tree core I'm showing in this image is pink. And the reason for that is because we decided to look at microscopic wood anatomy for this work, which was really fun, new methodology for me to learn. And this is kind of based on the principle that, we know that tree rings or annual tree growth can be large or small, depending on variations in weather, competition and health, and all these different stressors. But the wood cells that make up those tree rings can also be bigger or smaller. And by looking at those cells there on the right-hand side, we're able to determine more about how the tree is physiologically responding to changes in stress in a way that relates back to ecosystem functions like carbon and water cycling. So all of that pink in the image, those are cell walls. And so that's carbon, pure and simple. That is where carbon is being stored in these trees. So how much carbon there is can tell us something about those carbon stores and fluxes. And then all of the white that you see is the empty pore space, or the lumen, that conducts water in the tree. So that tells us something about the hydraulic capacity, something about the water cycling each year that this tree is capable of. So to do this, we took a regular tree core, we sliced it really thin, stained it with these pink and blue dyes to highlight those carbon structures, and then scanned it at high resolution so that we could conduct some image analysis on each of those cells, each of those tracheids, and come up with a bunch of summary metrics for those cellular features. So to introduce you to a few of the cellular features that I want to talk about, I want to just show you what these data kind of look like, right? So this is the change in several cell features over time, broken down by whether the trees were bark beetle resistant, so those live trees, or bark beetle susceptible, those dead trees in red. And a couple things to point out here. The first one being, for each of these different traits, there's a difference between the dead trees and the live trees, right? So for example, cell wall thickness, that carbon storage metric there on the left-hand side, resistant trees had way higher carbon storage than the susceptible trees did pretty much over their entire lives, right? And then on the flip side, we were expecting defenses to really differ between trees, these resin duct numbers, but they didn't. So that was a little surprising to find as well. The other thing to point out is that all of these traits change over time. So not only are they different between tree groups, but they also change over time along the x-axis. And sometimes they're increasing, sometimes they're decreasing, sometimes they're changing in parallel between tree groups, and other times they're not. And so this is a really important thing for us to be able to tease apart in our analysis so that we can figure out, what aspects of change over time in these traits are being driven by annual weather variability and trends in climate. So we detrended all of these different traits and then conducted a superposed epoch analysis to estimate basically how much variability in those traits was coming from extreme weather events. So we looked at various extreme weather events, either the bottom or top percentiles of temperature, snowpack, precipitation, drought, a bunch of different ones, so that we could figure out whether those extreme weather events were driving variability in these traits. So the take-home message that I want you to get from this is that bark beetle resistant trees were also more warming resistant. And there are 3 different pieces of evidence that point to this result. So if you're not familiar with looking at these superposed epoch analysis results, what we're looking at here is anything below that black line means a negative response, and anything above means a positive response, again, broken down by whether trees were resistant or susceptible to bark beetles. And so our first result here is that bark beetle resistant trees stored much less carbon in cold years Actually, both tree groups did, right? So we have these negative responses of cell wall thickness to minimum summer temperatures. And what that's providing is some evidence for energy limitation, right? If it's too cold, trees aren't able to store carbon. But this was particularly true for those the bark beetle resistant trees. They actually liked things to be a little bit warmer. And when things were too cold, they were unable to store the same levels of carbon. The second piece of evidence here is that bark beetle resistant trees created larger cells in hot years. So these are really laying the foundation for the tree's capacity to transport more water in the future. And they were able to do that best when temperatures were warmer. So here you can see luminaria, that's the white or basically the empty pore space in a tree cell that conducts water, was negatively associated with maximum summer temperatures for dead trees. So that negative response in red, but it was positively associated with summer temperatures for live trees in blue. And so the bark beetle resistant trees were having a positive response to warmer temperatures, whereas the dead trees, the trees that ultimately died, had a negative response. The final piece of evidence here is that bark beetle resistant trees put on more total growth, more total ring width during wet years of high snowpack. So what this is telling me is that they were able to make use of those larger cells that they were able to put on in warmer years and really take up all of this snowpack and ultimately grow more than the beetle susceptible trees. So what this is kind of telling us is that when we take a look at the annual scale, right? So that last study was looking at 30-year windows. When we break things up into just individual years, we actually find an interplay between energy limitation and water limitation for these trees, right? And this is reflecting the fact that there is tremendous variability in weather at the annual time scale. We have some hot years, some dry years, some wet years, and kind of everything in between. And the key is that the bark beetle resistant trees were able to thrive in both the hotter years and the wetter years. And in fact, their positive responses to the hot years allowed them to have positive responses in the wet years. And this is something that set them apart from the beetle susceptible trees. And so what we wanted to do was to figure out, okay, here are all these different differences in climate responses. How does this actually contribute to survival probability? And I'm happy to talk more about this model for those of you who are interested in the modeling. But basically what we did was we hindcasted these trait values back to the late 1800s to say, if these trait values have some relationship with survival and some relationship with climate, then how did their survival probabilities change over time? And what you see in this figure on the left-hand side there is that the probability of survival was roughly similar between the bark beetle susceptible and resistant trees earlier in their lives. So back there in the early 1900s. And what really happened is that we see this divergence over time that is driven by, white pine blister rust invading and warming kind of together, creating this large divergence in the survival probability and ultimately in the mortality of those trees in red. And so what I want to point out here is that when white pine blister rust came on scene to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, that was in about the mid 1940s, we start to see this decline in the probability of survival, especially for the trees that ultimately died. This could mean that they had worse infection. It could mean that, they had kind of underlying predisposition to not being able to defend themselves very well. We don't know, unfortunately. Maybe that will be the next study. But something else that we see here is that during that 1980s period of rapid warming, the trees that ultimately survived recuperated. So even though they were in slight decline when white pine blister rust first invaded, that warming really helped them and they started to recuperate. And we were able to mechanistically pin this to that increase in hydraulic conductivity and carbon storage in those trees. So ultimately what we found is this shift towards water limitation does absolutely matter for survival. And in conjunction with what we think is probably being driven by white pine blister rust, there were clear differences in the ability of beetle-resistant and bark beetle-susceptible trees to make use of warmer and wetter climates. So warming resistance was associated with bark beetle resistance, but there was this important interplay between energy and water limitation at the annual scale. So what this tells us is that in the future, if we don't have any snowpack, if snowpack really dwindles, then those beetle-resistant trees won't have any water to fill those larger cells with, and we would expect them to become more stressed as well. Okay, so the final piece of the puzzle here is we have all these trees dying, a tremendous amount of mortality in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. What does that mean for the ecosystem more broadly? Is biodiversity resilient to whitebark mortality, or are we seeing declines, which might be predicted due to the kind of the keystone species status of these trees? So this is really operating on that assumption or understanding really that whitebark pine is a tree island initiator, and it is helping to facilitate other species, particularly in these really harsh uppermost tree line and kind of alpine tree line ecotone habitats. And so what we looked at in this study was the biodiversity of understory plants. So those plants that are being directly facilitated and kind of the ways that have been studied quite a bit in terms of the solar and wind protection by whitebark pine. But then we also wanted to look at mycorrhizal fungi. And so very brief crash course in mycorrhizal fungi is that these are the friends of trees. These are the fungi that are helping to provide nutrients and water to trees, especially in these harsh high elevation habitats, in return for the trees donating a little bit of photosynthetic sugar to those fungi. And so we wanted to look at both of these different types of biodiversity because understory plants really contribute to the wildlife habitat value of the ecosystem and the soil stability, kind of water regulation ecosystem services, while the mycorrhizal fungi really contribute to the forest's ability to recover following disturbance, right? So if we find mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with helping whitebark pine seedlings, that is great news. It tells us that this forest might be poised to recover following mortality. So for this study, my master's student, Kelly Goodwin, again, went back to Grand Teton National Park and did a bunch of sampling in that same forest type that we talked about before. So that kind of right below the alpine tree line ecotone in these clumpy tree island forests that have experienced about 50% overstory mortality of whitebark pine in the past 5 years. And so what she did here was she first sampled the understory plants beneath live, dying, and dead whitebark pine and in the unforested area, kind of those grassy meadows outside the forest in between the tree islands. And she also sampled rocky habitats and deeper soils habitats to start getting at this question of how habitat harshness, so to speak, contributes to these biodiversity patterns. She identified all of the understory species, 2 species, and also included tree seedlings in this. So it's not just understory plants, but it's also the tree seedlings, mostly whitebark pine and subalpine fir, that she observed in these quadrats. For the fungal sampling, Kelly made these little mesh ingrowth bags filled with sand. So that's what you're looking at in that top image. They're about this big, they would fit in your hand. And she and some other lab mates hiked those up to tree line. So carrying over 50 pounds of sand to tree line was just an incredible task. And they buried those, again, under live, dying, and dead whitebark pine and in the unforested matrix. That's kind of what you're looking at here in this bottom right-hand image, so that we could start making those comparisons. At the end of the growing season, right before the snow came, they went back, dug all the bags up, and strained off any fungal hyphae that had penetrated those bags. So the whole idea behind these ingrowth bags is that as they're buried in the soil, the mycorrhizal fungi are kind of foraging through the soil for nutrients, and as they do so, they might penetrate these bags. So we're able to really capture the most active species in those areas. So what you're looking at here in the bottom left-hand corner is straining off those hyphae, looking at them under the microscope, and basically dealing with these incredibly small amounts of biomass to extract and amplify DNA and then identify those DNA to species when we can, or to genera, to the least taxonomic unit available. So she used the fungal database for that. And so when I talk about the fungal results here, I'll be distinguishing between AMF, which is arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi in this system. Those are basically exclusively associating with the herbaceous understory plants. And then EMF, which is ectomycorrhizal fungi. These are associating with the conifers and very few, some of the woody shrubs in the area. So what did we find? In terms of understory plants, the main takeaway here is that whitebark mortality was not associated with biodiversity loss. So what we're looking at here is the species richness of understory plants in the rocky and soils habitats. We see that all of those bars in each of the habitat types are pretty much the same height between the live, dying, and dead whitebark pine. So biodiversity, all in all, was pretty much unchanged as a function of mortality. What we did see was some compositional change, specifically in those rocky habitats. So you can see if we compare the live and dead trees, we see a reduction in the forb contingent. So fewer wildflowers under dead trees in these rocky habitats, and kind of an increase in the shrub component. So there was some species turnover in these rocky habitats. They were a little bit less resilient to whitebark pine mortality than the soils habitats. This is maybe starting to get at the idea that these harsher habitats show facilitation by whitebark pine, not just in the establishment phase, but maybe also in the persistence phase for these plants. Although we did observe compositional change, it was relatively small in magnitude, right? So what you're seeing here is a non-metric multidimensional scaling plot. If you don't know what that means, it's okay, because I'll just kind of describe what we're looking at here. The green ellipses are the understory communities for soils habitats, and the orange ellipses are the understory communities for rocky habitats. And what you see is that they're a little bit different, but they overlap. So, these communities were distinct, but not diametrically opposed, so to say. And then the third thing we're looking at is the unforested vegetation type down all those black lines in the bottom left-hand corner. And what you'll notice is that neither the green nor orange ellipses are overlapping with that unforested state. So what this is telling us is that even after whitebark pine mortality, the understory communities did not become more similar to the understory communities in an unforested place. So there wasn't really evidence of an ecotype change in those understory plants from a forested vegetation type to an unforested vegetation type. So this is good. This shows, again, some degree of resilience in these communities. Okay, what about the fungus? The mycorrhizal fungi, the friends of trees. So the first thing I want to point out here is it's the same story. We found that whitebark mortality was not associated with biodiversity loss of the mycorrhizal fungi. And so what we're looking at here is, again, the species richness of different types of mycorrhizal fungi being compared between live, dying, and dead trees along that x-axis, and also the unforested matrix. And the first thing we'll notice is that the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, AMF, were the same across all of these different types of kind of under canopy habitats. And that's expected, right? These are the fungi that are mostly associating with herbaceous plants. We didn't see a huge change in herbaceous plants, and that's reflected in stability in the AMF community. We did see a slight trend that specialist ectomycorrhizal fungi were highest near live whitebark. And so this was not statistically significant, but I'm interested in getting a higher sample size in the future and seeing what we can tease out here, because it's an interesting pattern to consider that the EMF most responsible for associating with these live whitebark pines decreased as the trees died and in that unforested matrix. So this might have implications for highly disturbed forests in terms of their ability to regenerate if all of those specialist EMFs are gone, or at least declining. In the opposite pattern, we found that generalist EMFs were highest near whitebark that were dead. So these are EMF fungi that are able to associate not just with whitebark, but with subalpine fir and spruce and maybe some shrubs. So they have a more generalist habit. And we saw those increasing under recently dead trees. So part of what this is telling us is that they're able to, well, what we know about EMF is that they're able to also engage in decomposition processes. So part of this pattern might be driven by that simple fact that these EMF species are kind of moving into these disturbed areas and engaging more in a decomposition habit rather than their mycorrhizal friendship habit. As a similar story with the plants, we did see compositional change in the fungal communities. And like I said, these communities became more generalized. So what you're looking at here is the species of ectomycorrhizal fungi that we found under live and dead trees. And what you'll notice is that we lost 2 out of 3 pine specialist fungi when trees died, and then we gained a bunch of generalists. So this is kind of just another way of looking at that previous result where we didn't see total changes in biodiversity, but we did see compositional change, an increase in those generalist fungi. The final piece of this puzzle is combining the understory plant community with the mycorrhizal fungal community and looking at associations there, right? So we've kind of found this good news that biodiversity was unaltered, but we did find compositional change. So does it matter for seedling regeneration? And the final piece of this puzzle says, yes, it does. The increase in generalist ectomycorrhizal fungi was associated more strongly with regeneration of subalpine fir. So what you're looking at this figure is some correlations between subalpine fir, Abies bifolia, and whitebark pine. They're kind of on the x-axis or on the y-axis, and then a bunch of different types of ectomycorrhizal fungi, taxa along the x-axis. And so all of those little blue dots that I have put squares around is telling us that there is a positive association. So in places where we saw some of these fungi, we saw more Abies bifolia seedling regeneration. And what you'll notice is that there are more blue dots for Abies bifolia than there are for whitebark pine. So what that's really telling us is that these generalist ectomycorrhizal fungi were more strongly associated with subalpine fir regeneration than whitebark pine. So to kind of wrap this all up, what we found is that composition, but not biodiversity, was altered by whitebark pine mortality. Those understory plant communities in particular seemed resilient to ecotype change, to that unforested state. But increasing generalist fungi were associated with subalpine fir regeneration. And so this might result in stronger competition between whitebark pine and subalpine fir seedlings, especially given what we know about their competitive dynamics already. All right, so those are our 3 interrelated studies that kind of tell this big picture story about how climate change is interacting with different stressors to alter whitebark pine ecosystems. To kind of give you the key takeaways from these 3 studies, water stress is decreasing tree growth for whitebark pine, even at upper tree line, where we might expect the trees would be most protected from climate change. Luckily, the trees that are able to deal with that increasing water and warming stress were more likely to survive bark beetle attack and maintain those carbon and water cycling functions through the wood anatomical traits that I showed. And finally, some good news, biodiversity is resilient to whitebark pine die-off. Although compositional shifts are kind of hinting that there might be differential regeneration of subalpine fir in these disturbed areas as a consequence of increased association with the helpful mycorrhizal fungi. So all of these studies together really kind of hit home this understanding that we have to look at how all of these different stressors are interacting and influencing forest health and recovery. So in just the last minute here, I want to give a shout out to some recent work that we're doing to kind of build on these questions in Grand Teton National Park and specifically investigate the interactive effects of elevation-dependent warming across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, starting here in Grand Teton National Park. So with my collaborator, Tucker Furness, we've established a series of permanent monitoring sites in forests across an elevational gradient in Grand Teton from about 6,500 feet up to 10,000 feet, so upper tree line. And so that's what you're looking at here. These dots are our permanent sites. And the cool thing that we've done here is we mapped every single tree in these study sites. So what this work has given rise to are these STEM maps. So what you're looking at is each dot in our 25-hectare study site, so about a little over 50 acres in size, and every single tree is a dot that we have mapped relative to one another, where the different colors show different species. So this is really going to help us get at those shifts in competitive dynamics between trees and between canopy species and seedlings. So you can see in that bottom right-hand image there, we also have mapped and identified each whitebark pine seedling and are able to track the regeneration and mortality of those seedlings relative to the topography and canopy habitat that they're growing in. And one of the cool things to note about this is that we actually found whitebark pine seedlings in all of these sites, even the lowest elevation sites. I'm going to skip over this so we have some time for questions. But the last piece here is that we've entered these data into the Smithsonian Forest Global Earth Observatory, or ForestGEO. And so this is a global network of permanent forest monitoring sites that will allow us not only to think about elevation-dependent warming impacts in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, but also in the context of global change in forests across all of these different 84 sites globally. So with that, I want to thank the very, very many people who supported this work, directly contributing to data collection, permitting, and manuscript preparation. Just a huge amount of work has gone into these 3 studies, and I've just been incredibly lucky to be able to work with all these folks. So with that, I won't take up too much more time, and I would love to answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much for your talk, Sarah. I would like to open the opportunity for our attendants for one last time to share your comments and questions. Please do it in the chat box. We have about 4 to 5 minutes, and please type your questions and comments in the chat as I mentioned. And if we don't have enough time to go over all of this, don't worry, I'll make sure to collect all of them with your contact information, and I'll address them to Dr. Germain after our talk. So we have a couple of questions already collected here. The first one is a comment by Diana Tombach. Her comment is, "Hi Sarah, the tree core work was really interesting. Your final slide said upper tree line. I think you meant either the lower alpine tree line ecotone or upper subalpine. The lower alpine tree line ecotone is defined by tree flagging and reduced statue and or crumpled trees and tree island patches. The upper alpine treeline ecotone is defined by the transition from crumples to tundra, no more conifers, and that she's happy to chat after the talk.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for pointing that out. I just want to clarify, you're totally right. What I mean is the kind of that boundary at the lower end of the alpine tree line ecotones. We still have timber trees there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So the first question is from Dustin Perrin. They say, were your bark beetle resistant trees partially attacked by mine pound beetle, either strip or just low density attack, showing they had survived a beetle attack? Or has these trees just not been recently attacked by mountain pine beetle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So whether the trees were attacked or not is hugely important, right? Because that tells us if they were attacked and they survived, then they had sufficient defenses to kind of expel those beetles. There was no evidence in the field that those trees were attacked. So it appears that there was some kind of difference in the probability that they would be attacked in the first place. Now, if a tree is only attacked by 1 or 2 beetles, it's really hard to find evidence for that in the tree rings. Usually we see evidence of mass attack. So it is completely possible that those trees were attacked by just a few beetles and successfully defended themselves. And based on the mechanisms that we found, given that there were very few differences in defenses between resistant and susceptible trees, if they were able to defend themselves better from those bark beetles attacking. It most likely had something to do with their ability to transport resin rather than the number of physical defenses alone. But to answer your question, we don't know. I think it's really likely that they were probably attacked just in very small numbers.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. We have a few questions from the webinar team. Well, our attendees drop extra questions in the chat. The first one is, could you elaborate a little bit more on the selection of the trees that were cored for your first chapter? If I'm not wrong, you mentioned that like 30 plus trees were selected.
Yes. So technically, we actually cored, I want to say 78 trees. We cored a lot of trees. We have the permanent monitoring site that I kind of touched on there at the end, and it was a full census. So we cored every single tree. We weren't, this kind of sets it apart from some climate analyses that are really trying to choose trees that we think are going to show the strongest climate signal. We specifically didn't want to do that. We wanted to choose just your average Joe tree to see how these forests were really responding to changing climate. And so we got all of them in our study site that were either dying or dead. And so that was kind of across a small elevational gradient of about 300 feet and across either, kind of within the tree islands or solitary trees out on the cliffs.
Great, great. That's a huge effort.
Mhm.
Our next question is from Haley Wilmer. They say, great presentation, Sarah. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the historic herbivorous grazing and fire regimes in your study area, and how those might impact understory biodiversity at high elevation.
Yeah. I when I was making this talk, I felt kind of guilty for not talking about fire at all. So I appreciate this question. So if I'm thinking about the Grand Teton site up in those tree islands, most likely the historic fire regime was of mixed severity, super patchy and infrequent fire return intervals. So my gut instinct, I haven't actually done a study on this, but my gut instinct is that fire was not as important of a driver of understory biodiversity in this habitat as it might be just slightly lower in elevation where we would get, stand replacing disturbances in some of those closed canopy forests. Now, with respect to grazing or herbivory, that's a really good question. I know that part of the reason that we wanted to look at understory plants is because of their wildlife habitat benefits. But at the same time, this is not exactly a high productivity area. Some of those photos of those plants, they're tiny, they're small. They might have made a pika happy here and there, but I know that bison can be at high elevations, but there's not tremendous herds of bison or elk up in this particular study site. Historically, there might have been more elk and moose in this area, but there hasn't been a huge amount of decline in those populations in Grand Teton, at least. And so my guess is that at least in terms of that type of kind of large ungulate versus small mammal herbivory, there probably hasn't been a huge amount of change over the course of this forest since it became a park. But technically, I don't know, and I would love to hear from someone more expertise in wildlife than me.
That's really interesting. And a final question from the webinar team. So based on your temperature changes results for your first project, you're showing graphs based on the historical record data. Is there a reason to believe that whitebark would perceive multiple temperature shifts in their lifetime? Like assuming that they could live up to a couple hundred years and potentially make a point for being more adaptable than we expect? I wonder if this is something that can be tested with climatic reconstruction for a few extra centuries back from the historical record.
Okay, there are a lot of moving pieces in that one. Would you mind repeating it for me so I can really chew on it?
Yes. So based on your temperature changes results within the historical record, is there a reason to believe that a whitebark would perceive multiple temperature shifts in their lifetime?
Yeah, so I think that one of the challenges with climate data is that we only have really good data for the instrumental record to the kind of mid 1900s. So I agree that using some type of climate reconstruction data might help us go further back in time and start to answer this question about whether trees have experienced this same kind of thing earlier in their lifetime, because we kind of think that they probably did, right? Especially if we think back to some of the really old trees, they almost certainly have experienced large fluctuations in temperature. One of the challenges with using climate reconstructions to tell us something about tree growth is it can be a little bit circular, since those climate reconstructions are often made using tree rings to begin with. And so we would want to make sure that we're using a reconstruction that was built using a different data type, like lake cores or, tree rings in a completely different area if we wanted to do that. But I do think that it's a good point that these trees likely have experienced shifts in temperature. And what's really different now is that they're experiencing shifts in temperature and snowpack at the same time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. In the final minute, I'm going to share the QR code that Kara made a mention at the beginning. Um, oh, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much again for participating in this webinar, Sarah. There is only one question that was not an answer. We're going to make sure to collect it and address it to you with the contact information of our audience member. And thank you very much, everyone, for participating on this series of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. And I'm really happy that you welcome our new teams for the next iteration of the series. And yes, we'll see you in a couple of months.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.